Hi everyone and welcome to a new episode of CNB here on the NDTV network. I'm Siddharth Vinayak Parthankar and we have something special lined up for you on the program today. Nearly 140,000 people die on Indian roads every year in nearly 5 lakh accidents. Now that's just the worst safety record when it comes to accidents all across the world. And mind you, these are just the official figures, with some estimates claiming that the real numbers are twice as high. India is currently the world's 6th largest car market. It's expected to cross Germany and become the 4th largest by 2020. Global NCAP, or New Car Assessment Program, is a car safety program which evaluates all new automobile designs for performance against various safety threats. Now, last year, Global NCAP decided for the very first time to carry out a test on some of India's best-selling cars. Most other markets already have their own NCAP program. Remember, in India, we don't have one, and this test was designed to assess their safety levels. We were the only ones invited to take part and witness these tests. Remember, nobody else has the details that we're going to be giving you right now. Here are the cars that were chosen. The very first one is the Tata Nano, which is the smallest car of the pack. Up next, the Alto 800 from Maruti Suzuki, which is India's best-selling car, followed very closely by another bestseller, the Hyundai i10. You've got another hatchback, the Ford Figo, which is fairly popular in the market too, remember, in terms of volumes, and the Volkswagen Polo rounds things off for the 5 cars that were selected. All of these cars are made in India models, and only the most basic or entry-level version that's available in the market for you to buy, well, that's the one that was selected for testing, which means that none of them had airbags as part of standard equipment. Now, there were 2 tests carried out on identical cars of the same make. The United Nations Regulation 94, which is a crash test carried out at 56 kilometers per hour, and then the Latin NCAP 2013 assessment protocol, which is the most recent NCAP protocol, where the car is crashed at 64 kilometers per hour. All of the manufacturers that we talked about, and of course the Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers, or SIAM, were informed of these tests, which were carried out in Germany at the ADAC facility where the cars were shipped late last year. Now, all of the tests used crash test dummies. Let's quickly run you through just why that becomes relevant. Now, here you can see the kind of dummy that's been used. Lots of sensors all over this, which kind of tells you basically what happens in the event of an accident with a real human being. You've got sensors in the head, the jaw, the torso, elbow. You've got one in the femur, the tibia, and then, of course, at the ankle. All of these sensors will relay a certain amount of data at the end of that crash test, which tells you the kind of injury that could be sustained in an accident of that nature. We've also got a color-coded guide here that tells you just what happened to that dummy after the impact of the crash. Green is good because that's the least amount of injury sustained. You've got yellow as the next grade, orange, which tells you that things are getting a little bit tough here, and then finally you've got brown and red, red being the most fatal or the most serious kind of injury that could be sustained. Now, besides the sensors on the dummy itself, there are lots of sensors all over the car as well. So the car is prepped before it can actually undertake this kind of a test. Let's run you through just how all of that was done. We've got the Tata Nano as the first example. The ADAC facility in Landsberg is often the site when not just NCAP, but even the automobile industry biggies bring their cars for testing. It was the first time, though, that Indian-made cars were here for tests. We are about to witness the frontal 54 km/h UN regulation test on the Tata Nano. Now, to be fair, the Nano was developed as a basic product and more an alternative to two-wheelers than to existing small cars. But we were still intrigued about how it would do. The car was prepped for the crash by putting in a lot of the testing equipment in the back, which tracks the data that comes in from multiple sensors all over the car's structure. And then in went the dummies. Only 2 adult crash test dummies are being used here, no child dummies in the back, since the rear of the Nano is not child restraint system friendly. We have 2 dummies that have been inserted into this car. They're both average sized adult dummies. Now that's pretty much the way that the regulation test goes here in Europe. So you don't have children in the back in this car. You don't have child seats either as a result. So both these dummies average weight of about 73, 74 kilograms, 173 centimeters in height. And the way that the car has been set up here is for a frontal crash, but one that is sort of biased towards the driver's side. So a 40% bias, if you will. So the impact zone would be somewhere around here. Now, of course, you get to see the test actually happening in just a short while. But the point I want to make here is something that's really interesting, which I've picked up on after my conversations here. It's not so much about what happens to the car after the test as what happens to the occupants. That's the part that has to be assessed. That's the part which eventually becomes important in the event of a real-world accident, isn't it? How quickly can you extricate the accident victims? How much of a damage have they sustained to their actual physical body, not just what happens to the car, like I said. So that's the part which is going to be assessed. So you can see these dummies that have been placed inside. They have lots of sensors all around them and different parts of the body, different joints, different areas. That's the data which actually has to be assessed. Once the dummies went in and all the wiring and sensors were in place, it was time to get some paint onto them. Sounds strange, but the idea of putting different colors of wet paint on various body parts of the dummy is to be able to instantly get a visual sense of what parts of the car impacted with what body part after the crash. And now it's almost time to get started. You can see that Tata Nano is quite a distance away. That's the distance the car is going to travel for this test. The speed, 56 kilometers per hour. That's the regulation speed for such a test. And this big blue block that you see over here, I'll try and think of it as another car because this is going to simulate 2 cars crashing into each other with that bias towards the driver's side, as I said. And so if you come close, you'll actually see a little bit of a sticker here. That's like a target, if you will, that the other car has to come and impact onto. And you can see that my hand's picking up a lot of laser signals. There's lots of different lasers that have been set up which actually assess the speed, the point of impact. All of that is measured very carefully and to a scientific certainty as well. So this is going to be the other vehicle in this test. And well, now it's all about the car actually coming in and crashing into this block. Let's take a look at it. Besides lasers, there are a slew of slow-motion HD cameras too that pick the whole thing up. And you will see their output soon. Now you can take a look at what's exactly happened in here. The big rod back there, that's the steering column which is collapsed. You can see the clutch as well as brake pedals have both traveled upwards and the dummy's leg was actually caught between them. So a huge compromise when it comes to this particular space. Most of that steering column as well as even the structure of the car have pretty much collapsed into the occupant. And this wasn't very high speed. 56 kilometers per hour is pretty much in line with the kind of speeds you and I drive at, isn't it? Even in our city traffic, that's the kind of speeds most of us would look at, which is why this test becomes so relevant. And the thought to be kept in mind, most of our highways have an 80 to 90 kilometers per hour speed limit, if not higher. Now that's the other guy, as it were. That's the other car in this impact. And as you can see, hasn't sustained as much damage as what typically would happen in such a test. And that's simply because the Nano isn't a very heavy car to begin with. The point that very often gets confused here is, should this car have been heavier? Should it have been built with thicker steel? That's not the issue. The issue is how that particular structure absorbs the impact. So a car can be really light, and yet it can be extremely safe.
Jetzt müssen wir mit den Stecker hinein durch. Geklebt oder was?
I want all of you to consider one point very carefully. This isn't a witch hunt. This isn't about the Tata Nano. It's not about one model. It's not about one manufacturer. You have seen that the test that's been carried out here has taken into consideration all the popular cars, the ones that you and I either have already bought or are considering as a purchase decision. And so the point is, what happens in the event of such a collision, such an accident? That's the point to be considered. What do we need in terms of regulation for these cars? Should they be designed or built differently? Should there be equipment like airbags on board? Should you care when you're making that decision, and should you have that information before you can actually go ahead and make that purchase? That's the larger point of this. So like I said, you shouldn't misunderstand this as being just a hunt against one car or one manufacturer. This is a much larger point that goes back to vehicle occupant safety for our country, for our people.
Most people probably know somebody who's been in an accident, but they think it won't happen to me. But of course, statistically it does. And we've seen, for example, in the UK, in the early 70s, there were about 7,000 road deaths a year. Now it's under 2,000. Now a big proportion of that is passenger safety in the vehicles. And it's no good saying it won't be me. And people will go and buy a lottery ticket and think they might win, and yet the chance of being in a serious road accident is much higher than winning a lottery. So when people think about it sensibly, they will say, I'll spend the money on that. It's not just me, it's my family as well.
Now let's show you the car's 64 kilometers per hour test. So you saw both those tests being carried out on the Nano there, both the speeds. Let's take you through the assessment of those tests. What you're seeing here is a chart that kind of tells you just where things ended up. That's the car that was crashed. The 56 kilometers per hour, or the UN test, well, the result there was quite simply it didn't pass. Now, there are two parameters being checked there: structural integrity of the car itself, and then, of course, whether the car had airbags or any other safety devices. The Nano does not have that as standard, and so which is why it was a not pass result on the UN test. On the NCAP test, which is the 64 kilometers per hour test, once again, no star rating at all being given to the Nano, with 0 points coming in. The two dummies, now there's a reason why you're seeing a lot more red on the driver's side dummy. Quite simply, you saw in the crash that it wasn't a full head-on collision, but what you saw was the car getting impacted on one side with a greater bias towards the driver. That's typically the case in the majority of the accidents, especially on the highway, which is why the test is carried out like that, and which is why you're seeing a large number of fatal injuries being sustained by the driver in this accident. On the passenger side, things are a little bit better. However, you are still seeing a little bit of orange there, which could be serious. And remember, it's not just about the injuries sustained in the accident, it's also about how quickly that person can be then removed from the wreckage of that vehicle. So all of that is assessed when you talk about this. Now it's time to take a look at the next car, which is the Alto 800. Now, the videos you're seeing from here on are just the 64 kilometers per hour crash test, which is the NCAP test. A look now at the assessment on the Alto. Once again, you can see that the similar sort of test was carried out with a bias more towards the driver's side, which means the injuries sustained for the driver's side dummy far greater than what you're seeing on the passenger side. More fatal injuries all over the body. The head here, though, as far as the passenger side goes, sustaining very minor injuries or safer overall in that sense. The score, well, once again, on the NCAP test, it is a 0, no star rating, and it's a not pass when it comes, not surprisingly, to the UN rating as well, because once again, remember, structural integrity, not just airbags, being measured here. Now, a look at the Hyundai i10. Now, the i10 is a very popular model. Once again, you saw there a car that is made in India for the Indian market. Remember, the i10 is also a car that's exported only from India. So it's interesting how you have different star ratings for some of the i10s that are sold in other markets. The Euro NCAP i10, for example, scores pretty high. What you're seeing here, though, the India model, no star rating coming in on the Euro NCAP and a not pass on the UN test as well. When it comes to the injuries, once again, very fatal injuries to the driver and fairly serious injuries coming in for the passenger. Once again, extricating the dummies was quite difficult, we are told. And you have, remember, the very base version or the entry-level car being used for the test. Similar situation, of course, with the Ford Figo. Now that's quite a collision that you can see that's taken place on this Ford Figo. But the good part, take a look at it from the A-pillar backwards. The cabin, the fact that the door opens, all of that integrity is actually showing that the build quality on this car in terms of crash worthiness is actually pretty solid. We're not surprised because the Figo, remember, is based on the previous generation European Fiesta. The point where the car starts to lose out, even though that overall structural integrity seems to be pretty good, is the lack of an airbag as standard equipment. Take a look at this. Now this is, of course, come off the steering wheel itself. The red, remember, the paint from the dummies, the red and the green indicate that there was some amount of impact both for the forehead, because this is the eyebrow, and also the nose, which is the green paint that you can see here. Had there been an airbag, you wouldn't see this kind of injury to the dummy or to the person in the case of an accident. And so that's how a car like this, which otherwise has been built pretty well, still loses out. Speaking of European platforms, the next one we have for you is the Polo from Volkswagen. Once again, the Polo is manufactured all over the world. It's not just in India, but the one that was tested was the made in India for India model. And the assessment on the Polo now, lots of green on this one as well. You can see both the dummies doing not so badly. And remember, this is a fairly even sort of a color scale on both the dummies, even though the accident was biased more towards the driver's side. So the lack of an airbag, well, that's the reason why the score isn't too high. But at the same time, structural integrity on the Polo was pretty uniform and pretty sound, which was not surprising perhaps, and which is why we do have different kind of reactions coming into these tests. Very somber note, but something worth thinking about. We will slip into a short break here on CNB. We have plenty more coming up. Welcome back to CNB. All of the manufacturers involved were invited to be a part of the test. There was a complete transparency. The fact that these cars were shipped to Europe, all of that was something that the manufacturers were informed about in all these cases, and they were invited as well. We've also reached out to the manufacturers in question, and we have some of the reactions from them. First up, Tata Motors says that it sees safety as a priority and is going to closely review the results of the Global NCAP test before drawing any conclusions vis-a-vis its product strategy. However, all its cars do meet all Indian safety regulations as mandated by the government at this time. The statement from Ford India: safety is one of the higher priorities in the design of our vehicles. Our vehicles consistently meet or exceed applicable industry standards. We are monitoring the progress of this review. Volkswagen India next. At Volkswagen, we recognize this need given increasing driving speeds, more women drivers, longer driving times, and a younger driver. Therefore, we have decided to have front dual airbags as standard on the Polo in India as our continuing commitment to safer and better driving. We are the first automaker in India to do so, making the Polo the safest premium hatchback in the market today. Now that, of course, was the quote from VW. In fact, Volkswagen sponsored its own test with Global NCAP after the previous test that you saw and sent across a basic variant now equipped with airbags, which has received a much higher rating. Let's quickly take you through that particular test now. So as you can see, there's a big difference between the car on the left and the right because, well, there are airbags deploying on the right, and that now is the new standard when it comes to VW cars in India. The Polo will have airbags on board. Now let me reiterate here that it's not just about airbags. Now we want to show you an example of a Chinese make car which has airbags but has no structural integrity. This kind of drives the point home. Take a look at what happens to the car. It pretty much disintegrates at that 64 km/h test, and well, the airbag's deployed, but really there's not much else left there as far as the front of that cabin goes, which shows you that it's not just about just adding one particular safety element. It's about making sure that the car does well on all safety parameters. This car clearly failing that test quite miserably. So now let's take a look at a Latin America model from Suzuki. This is the Celerio in Latin America, which is, by the way, made in India. We know it as the A-Star. Let's take a look at that test. What you see here, well, the cabin, the integrity of the cabin being maintained fairly well. Of course, there are airbags deploying, but just take a look at how the impact is absorbed by the car, where the cabin's structure behind the engine bay remaining fairly intact. And that's the whole point here we are trying to make, that it's not just about one element. Here you can see a car that is made in India, but it protects its occupants to a large extent. So that's the kind of idea we wanted to give you. Why was this done? Well, quite simply because you need to have testing like this for made in India vehicles as well, because safety may not be a huge priority for a lot of you buyers, but it certainly should be, considering the kind of accident levels we are seeing in our market. And we wanted to bring this to your attention, wanted you to think a little bit more about this. This isn't about ostracizing or pointing fingers at one particular car. The idea here is, what can this now do for the industry at large? That's the question we want to leave you with when it comes to what happens in the future. Should we have a global NCAP-like system in India, which means setting up an India NCAP? Well, that's something that NCAP globally is quite open to. Very recently, you had a China NCAP being set up. Prior to that, you had an ASEAN NCAP and a Latin America NCAP also being set up. So, well, India, with so many cars being sold and so much manufacturing, certainly should have either government-backed or industry-backed NCAP. That is the kind of thought, at least, we endorse here at CNB. So, quite a lot that we took you through. This was very exclusive information coming to you on the program. We want you to react to it, folks. Please go ahead to ndtv.com, post your comments there. A lot of the details on the story are available for you online as well. Or go ahead and tell us what you think on social media, NDTV Social, Twitter, Facebook. Please do go ahead and react to this, because this is something that should matter to both you and me and all of our loved ones as well, because, well, it could make a difference when it comes to the selection of your next car, a difference between life and death. Please react to that huge global NCAP story, something that we are very close to here at NDTV and at CNB. Remember, this is something that needs to be discussed. It needs to come into the overall national stage when it comes to buying new automobiles. We would like your reactions on that story. We will take that story forward, have plenty of follow-ups coming up for you over the year. So stay with us when it comes to safety, not just on the roads, but also inside the car's cabin. We will, of course, like to talk with you about safety when it comes to two-wheelers as well. So keep engaging with us on that particular point. It's a wrap here on CNB. Please wear your seatbelts. Please do wear your helmets if you're on a two-wheeler. Don't use your mobile phone if you're driving or riding. And I'll see you next week. It is the Auto Expo, so plenty to look forward to on the program next week.